All right, well, I think we have our panelists. Welcome, everyone, to our event today. This is the Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims Historical Society program. And what we're talking about today is the clerks of the court. So we're hosting a panel discussion today featuring the first three clerks of the court, and that is Melanie Dorsey, Robert Comeau, and Norman Herring. We're going to have it moderated by the fourth and current clerk, Gregory Block, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges faced in the early days of the court, the evolution of the position from the days of paper filing to electronic filing, and share their thoughts about the court's history. I'm going to let Greg introduce the other panelists, but I just wanted to give you a little background of Mr. Block. If you bear with me one second. And so Mr. Block, Gregory O. Block, was sworn in as Clerk of Court of the U.S. Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims by Chief Judge Bruce Castle in a ceremonial session of the court on September 1st, 2010. Mr. Block served in uniform for 30 years, having retired from active duty as a colonel in the Army Judge Advocate General's Corps, and he served in multiple overseas locations, including Germany, Korea, Bosnia, Afghanistan, and completed his service in Charlottesville, Virginia, where he served as Dean of the Judge Advocate General School. Mr. Block has an undergraduate degree from Washington State University, master's degrees from the University of Southern California and the Army War College, a law degree from Seton Hall University School of Law, and an LLM from the Judge Advocate General School. So that's a little background about the current clerk of the court. And I wanted to let Mr. Block sort of take it away and moderate from here.
Thank you for that reminder. Thanks to you, Brad, and thanks to the Bar Association and the Historical Society for hosting this event. I will tell you, being a clerk, I've had friends who said, what do you do? And I told them, well, I'm a clerk, and they said, that's too bad. And so I said, well, I'm the clerk of the court, and they said, you told me that already. It's pretty neat to have a lot of people sign in to listen to a bunch of old clerks kind of talk about things. And of course, this is a neat opportunity for me to do something I haven't had a chance to do, and that is talk in the same discussion with all of our former clerks. And let me begin with our first clerk, Melanie Dorsey. And I won't go through a lengthy background, just to say that Melanie was law clerking and government lawyering in a couple of places, couple different courts, and then also working at the Office of Government Ethics with the then director, a man named Nebeker, before coming to the court as the first clerk of this court. Bob Comeau was a guy like me, a 30-year JAG colonel. He was pit stopped in Vietnam for a while, and he came to the court as a special assistant to then Judge Nebeker, and then succeeded Ms. Dorsey in 1990. And then Norm Herring, former infantry officer injured in Vietnam, he lawyered at local, county, and state levels. And he also served as a California County Veteran Service Officer before coming to the court in December 2000. I wanted to give you a couple data points before we get started, and they are about the court today. So we're going to talk about history, but what about today? Just your frame of reference. And this might, I think, help our former clerks kind of think for a moment about just how far we've come. We have 9 active judges, 4 senior judges serving in recall through the year. Each of our judges has 4 law clerks, and we have clerks dedicated to support of our senior judges now too. In the last fiscal year ending 1 October 2020, the court took in almost 9,000 appeals and concluded more than 8,700 cases. Several thousand of these cases were resolved through judges' decisions, and the remainder were resolved through the court's Rule 33 conferencing process. The court is now hearing class actions in accordance with entirely new Rules 22 and 23. And we now, believe it or not, have more than 6,500 attorneys admitted into the court's bar. With regard to the facilities, the court is now the largest tenant at 625 Indiana. We have 9 active chambers and 4, soon to be 5, senior judge chambers, an updated courtroom recently named for Judge Nebeker. and a floor formerly occupied by the VA almost completely dedicated to IT and CLS conferencing staff. We recently opened a conference center and library on the first floor of this building. And then finally, with regard to technology, today we have superb IT infrastructure and support that has allowed the court to shift 98% of its staff into remote work during the pandemic without impacting court operations. And that remote work includes virtual or arguments that continue to be able to watch live on the court's YouTube channel. So that's the court of today. And I know that's not the court that my predecessors necessarily walked into. And that's what's fun about having them here with us today, because these foundations they built are what really allow us to have what we have today. And let me start first with Melanie Dorsey, because Melanie, our Historical Society had a prior presentation by some congressional staffers, and they were fascinating because they were fixated on what the court would do as a court in terms of its jurisprudence, but they didn't think much about what the court would do prior to working on that wonderful jurisprudence. And they really hadn't thought about the idea that, in fact, the court didn't even exist administratively. And so your Judge Nebaker, of course, gave us all a sense of what he encountered as the first judge of our court, which was, before he could think about jurisprudence, he had to buy toilet paper and find a room to use it in. And so you were the first clerk of the court. And, I wanted to ask you, how did you get finagled into joining the court as the first clerk? And then second of all, was it what you thought you were getting into?
May I answer the second part first? It was in no way what I thought was going to happen. What the dream that you were to me, it was a dream what you were just speaking about, especially the remote part of being able to have, like you said, 98% of your staff and work done remotely. But backing up for a minute, I knew Judge Nebaker when I was clerking for Judge Harris on the DC Court of Appeals. And those two judges were good friends, so the clerks were good friends. And so I felt like Judge Nebaker got to know me in that instance. He later hired me for the Office of Government Ethics after I'd been in private practice a while and didn't care for it as much as I thought I would. But I enjoyed OGE and being with a judge. And one day he really totally out of the blue to me called me in and said, how would you go to work on this brand new court that has been created, and I'm going to be the chief judge, and I'd love to have you go along. And of course, his right-hand person, Marlene Davis, was on board. So I said, sure. I had no idea what I expected it to be. It was much more administrative. I don't really think I felt like a lawyer. Well, I guess I did probably the second half of my tenure, but in the beginning, it really was totally from scratch. Figuring how do you get paid? That was the first question everybody wanted to know. When am I going to get my paycheck? Who's going to process it? How much will it be? And it was everything, not just the toilet paper, but pens, pencils, computers, telephones. And as you probably know, we ended up temporarily using the space that the Office of Government Ethics had been in at 1625 K Street. And I wouldn't say shabby necessarily about the quarters, but they were pretty dim. And it was, even the Office of Government Ethics had left. It was not a pristine place. It wasn't even light, sort of a funereal atmosphere to it. But we put a riser in the one room that was open for meetings, so it sort of looked like a courtroom. But it was almost kind of bizarre to be thinking that we really were a court. And it was very hard to explain to people about national jurisdiction and what do you mean the veterans have their own court? Well, and of course the main question, how do I get represented? How do I get before this court? And it was a lot of moving parts in the beginning, trying to put everything together just to get going.
Yeah, well, you said getting people paid. You didn't, who was on the team? I remember Judge Nebaker saying that he realized there was no court actually. And so he turned to these fantastic women he worked with, and I guess you were one of them, or maybe you were the one, and said, make it, pull it to get it together. And, so did you have an initial meeting where you all decided, how this was going to work? Was that with Judge Nebaker? And where were your priorities from day one in terms of getting going, understanding everybody wanted to have your first meeting of the court, no doubt?
Well, the judge and Marlene and I met, and the judge wanted the two top priorities to be finding some decent space, trying to get the mechanism for appeals to come in and the staff to handle them, and also getting paid, because no one's going to come to a job where you're not going to get paid. And after some research, it turned out that the Department of Agriculture would handle our payroll. And that's something, I was a government major in college, went to law school. I never even thought the Department of Agriculture would run a payroll, but they did. And I remember when I went down there, I kept getting directions and to go left, go right, so forth. And I really, truly felt like we were in a maze, and let alone the Department of Agriculture trying to set up a payroll. But it worked. It was a little bit cumbersome, but it did come about.
Right. And, as you think back to that period, what were the most challenging things you had to undertake? And did they surprise you?
Well, not having computers and the capability that brings you was much more than I thought it was going to be. And I also thought we would have technological equipment much faster than we did. The judge had hired Maria Ryan from the DC Court of Appeals, and she ran the clerk's office over there. And I knew her quite well. Marlene knew her quite well, as did the judge. And she was terrific at getting the clerk's office up and running. I mean, soon we had 30 people, and it seemed in the blink of an eye. But I would say lack of technology. And that's why I was commenting on your ability to handle things remotely. I find that very, very impressive, given the roadblocks we had.
Well, so you referred to the DC courts, and I think one of the questions that I've heard asked over the years is whether or not we had a sponsor in terms of helping us get going in that initial stage. Was it the DC courts? Did they have administrative offices that were supportive, or just an individual in particular?
It was just that Judge Nebaker and Judge Harris, whom I clerked for, happened to be there, and we were accused of, or Judge Nebaker was accused of poaching quite a few people from the clerk's office, which was true. And he got a little bit of grief from his old comrades about that, but they were not in any way supportive or founders or anything like that.
Right. And I've talked with people from the Court of Appeals and the Armed Forces who have DOD as a sponsor providing a lot of the services. I take it then there were no sponsors back in the day, and you were foraging for yourself.
Exactly.
Right.
And it just seemed overwhelming. You had to break it down into pieces and concentrate administratively for half a day, and then turn to the logistics of actually trying to read, because actually in the beginning, all of our petitions were handwritten, and trying to read them with the handwriting and understand them was hard. I remember some of us holding things up and trying to decipher what the letter writer was trying to convey to us. Even something like that was a bit of a hurdle to get over. But we got pretty good at reading most handwriting.
That's still happening. Yeah.
Oh, is it really?
Well, I wanted to ask you, when I look at the organization chart for our court, or for any appellate court, a federal appellate court, you see these major pieces in the clerk's office that include the public office and the central legal staff and administrative staff. As you just gathered with that little group of folks, yourself, Ms. Davis, and the judge, when did you begin to think through what were the pieces of the court that you needed to build, and at what point did you feel like they were beginning to take shape?
I felt the clerk's office was the most, given that we were not going to have computers and proper telephones and equipment for a while. We were working on that on the side, but I felt that having a clerk's office that was open and responsive and figured out appropriate ways to deal with petitioners who would call in, I felt that that was the most important thing that we had, not just because it's a public face, but that it's the basis to me for the court to bring those people in and to get them service and have their appeals heard. So I think when we hit 30 or 35 employees in the clerk's office, I was delighted. How many employees are there now in the clerk's office?
Well, we have some contractors, in the clerk's office alone, not quite a few more than that for sure. The clerk's maybe at about 140 if you include some of the contract support folks we have. But a lot of those are, because we have 4 clerks per judge and senior clerks as well, a lot of those are in chambers. But let me ask you, did you form a public office independent of this group of 20 or 30 as you got going? And did you form an independent central legal staff?
No, we did. There were some law clerks who came who were helping Judge Nebaker, but it was more of in a sense of helping, not being clerks for Judge Nebaker, but assisting him in the roadblocks and putting the pieces together. But again, I'm repeating myself, but the clerk's office was, we did not have a public office. I mean, that was something, that was a dream that we could have a public office. I remember thinking that there was one particular counter that looked like it had space and it was usually fairly clean that we could use for the public to come in, but we didn't have the other resources to back that up. So we didn't pursue that. I know it sounds very primitive. It was, but we gradually got there.
Right. Absolutely. Well, and I think most organizations, that the person who makes their first dollar frequently frames it. Was it that way when you got the first appeal? And I mean, how did it come in? Did you all just hold it up and go, oh my God, now we got to do something?
Well, there were a number of those handwritten petitions that all seemed to come. It was as if the Postal Service had gathered everything together and delivered them at once. But I do recall, and I think it may have been in November of 1989 when Judge Nebaker did a piece in the Post, I believe. But and the line that resonated with me the most was that we were leaving he and the court were leaving footsteps in the stand that of course we covered over, but we were getting somewhere and something was going to be made from all of this. And I just love that because of course the tides and so forth will erase those footprints anyway, but they were there, and we were, obviously there wouldn't be a court today if we hadn't gotten the ball rolling.
Absolutely. And when you got those first filings, were you thinking, oh my God, we've got to do something with these, but we aren't really organized at some point really to do much with them? Well,
one thing that was important to me was that we had, probably with every clerk, that you have standardized orders that would go out. I didn't want anything. So Maria Ryan actually in those days brought everything to me to look at before it went out in response to the petitioner. And I just was a stickler about that. And then developing those, and of course you have to modify them for certain situations, but I wanted to have uniformity to the extent that we could.
And, Melanie, you're referring to petition. Was it early business coming into the court petitions versus appeals, or can you recall?
Well, they were letters, I guess is what I should say. They were appeals from the board, but some of them styled themselves as petitioners. And I remember thinking to myself, do they think we're the Supreme Court or something? I mean, it just, there was a variety of names we were called, but they were appeals.
Well, you're making me laugh because we've always had issues with mail delivery on and off again, but probably delivered in bulk because it took them that long to figure out where you were. Maybe, I don't know.
Well, that and the handwriting on the envelopes too.
Yeah. So, obviously a person who walks into a court expects a certain organization and all these rules because you have to follow the rules. I mean, you didn't have any of those really, right?
Well, we put out, I guess it was in November of '89, we had interim rules that were adopted, and I think they were effective in December. And then meanwhile, Bob Comeau and others were working on a real set of court rules, but we did have interim rules by November, and that was a big deal for us, that we had something to frame what we were doing.
And were those modeled on another organization's rules, or?
That they were bits and pieces that Judge Nebaker liked from well, a lot of appellate rules, obviously, but that he liked, and I mean, he knew, having been on the DC Court of Appeals for so long, he knew what would work and what wouldn't, and this was a good starting point. As I say, framework to start from, and it just gave, we hope it gave people coming to the court, as well as employees, just an idea of how something would proceed once it got into the system.
Yeah. Well, and as you listen to me go through the vestiges or you know, the characteristics of the court today, did you hear some things that you could see flowed from work you had done?
Well, I certainly can't take credit for what the court is today, but I mostly felt a longing for all of the resources you've been able to put together, and what a fine mechanism and building, and 9 judges. And I mean, this is just, it's really nice to see all of that developing.
Well, I wanted to, I mean, you described what sounds like a very chaotic and crazy time, you know, the creation period. And Marlene Davis had told me a lot about what had gone into this. And quite honestly, I think she was thinking, she wanted to have it kind of a consolidated reference to these ideas, just in case somebody would do this again. And I have to tell you, my reaction to that was, this is absolute convincing proof that we should never do this. It's just too hard. But
well, and I might disagree, Greg, with Marlene's characterization of chaotic. It was definitely, there was urgency to it, and drivenness towards getting there. But we also had a sense of how we were going to be headed, and what directions, a lot of directions, but what directions that were more important than others. And it was also, there was a lot of camaraderie. I mean, you can imagine starting something with a group of people, and then other people with whom you've worked before coming over. It was, so it was a good group too, and that added to the fun of the court.
Yeah, well, to be fair, that was probably my word, chaotic, and not Marlene. Don't let Marlene put that into her mouth. Just sounded kind of crazy. You want to share any crazy anecdotes about that time? Anything strike you as?
Well, there was a question that I think you asked us to think about, and I think it was something along the lines of, what was the hardest thing you had to accomplish? And I thought about it, and there were a number of things that went through my mind, of course, but the hardest thing was when one of our employees in the clerk's office, I had known him from the DC Court of Appeals, when he came over and he filled out the paperwork and so forth for the Department of Agriculture, he put his wife's social security number in instead of his own, because he was so used to filling out forms for her. And it took us, I think, 2 whole weeks to get that straightened out. And at one point I said, John, I think we're just gonna have to pay you out of our pockets and try to recoup it later on, because that was, I mean, there was no HR department. There was no one to go to. It was just a one-on-one appeal trying to get this man paid.
Yeah, well, you're making me think of one of your colleagues, Becky Alexander, who when I came to the court, and I bet Norm and Bob would say the same thing, she told me something like, if you ever forget your social security number, call me, because I'll remember it. Just has this, absolute incredible memory. Or if you ever forget your birthday, call her, because she'll know it off the top of her head, which was awesome. Yeah. Well, hey Bob, does Melanie's commentary carry this right into you? And how did Judge Nebaker decide that he needed a special assistant? I don't see a special assistant on our org chart right now, but obviously it sounded like that was a good idea back then.
Yeah, I'm not sure that he knew exactly what he wanted either. He said he was looking for somebody to effect liaison with Congress, with the congressional staffs, and with the veterans organizations. However, it turned out I was just an odd job guy, filling in here and there. And of course, he selected me based on my vast experience in appellate jurisprudence. I had all of 6 months as an appellate criminal court judge in the Army, close to the end of my career, and that was about it. Anyway, he interviewed several people for that job, called me a few months later and said, you can have the job if you want it. When would you like to come to work? And I said, tomorrow, because at that point I was in a extended sabbatical after my military career, almost 2 years. And so I was happy to get back to work again. To pick up on some things that Melanie said, one of the things that we played with a lot in the early days is what is an appeal? And I can remember something coming in on a brown paper bag that said my head hurts and I need help. We applied the does it quack like a duck approach. We couldn't alter the filing time. So if it came in within 120 days of the board's decision, we tried to fit it in and then work with it from there. And it wasn't just the veterans who didn't understand the nature of our court. There were some on Capitol Hill who didn't understand either. And I can remember going to appropriations hearings and having the chair of the subcommittee say, well, can't you get together with the VA and work things out? And so the Chief Judge Neverker had to very patiently explain that wasn't how a court was set up, and it was an adversary procedure and two sides to the ball game and so forth. After a while, the understanding on the Hill picked up, and we were able to function better as a court. In those early days, also jumping from the interim rules, which were patterned largely after the federal rules of appellate procedure, we had a rules advisory committee. We had about 18 people from all parts of the House, some attorneys, some non-attorneys on it. And we were groping about how to approach this thing, because the federal rules were fairly expansive. And I looked through the rules and suggested to the committee that we may want to divide into 3 groups, one dealing with the rules that dealt with people, another one with the paper, and another one with the process. And so we did that, and we were able to put together the initial, or the second iteration of the rules in 1991 that kept the federal rules of appellate procedure numbering system, so that people who were familiar with federal litigation wouldn't have too much of an adjustment to make. Then after the committee developed those rules, I took them and gave them a scrub to insert as much plain English as possible, because at that point we had about 80% of our veterans were unrepresented. And so we had to really dumb down the system. And I was proud at that point to have eliminated all Latinisms except amicus curiae, figuring that one who was going to be one would know what it was. We also prepared an instruction sheet for unrepresented appellants, so that they had a simple definition of all the big words that we would be using and explain the process to them so that they would know what to do. And we developed a fill in the blanks 2-page brief if it came to that, so that we could deal with something from the appellant. And in those days, the clerk had pretty broad authority to manage the process going to the judge. So there were a lot of procedural orders that I prepared, and I had developed macros in WordPerfect so that I had a whole sequence of these orders that once again became fill in the blank, so we could deal with the volume of the cases coming in. And for our staffing, once we moved over Veterans Day weekend in 1990 from K Street to the very expansive quarters that you occupy now, or part of them, as the first tenants of that building, we were able to flesh out the staff. Now, as Melanie mentioned, we did a lot of robbing of the other courts in the area for staff. And I also looked out to pull in some veterans, particularly some senior NCOs who had been the chief legal clerks of the Marine Corps and the Air Force, and another senior NCO from the Army, so that they could be on the telephone front line, if you will, and could speak veteran to the veterans, because we were getting a lot of phone calls. And I prepared a little instruction sheet for those folks and for the people in the public office to tell them what they could answer and what they couldn't, and how to deal with a sorry about that, I can't answer a question. I told them basically, if the question comes in starting with can I or how do I, that's okay. You can tell them that. If they say should I, you don't answer those kinds of questions. And of course, when you're talking to can-do NCOs with a recent military background, they want to be able to help people often. So I had to pull in the reins a little bit on them so that they understood what the limitations were for the court. In 1992,
That's
yeah,
pretty fun stuff, Bob. And I can tell you that a lot of those things, for example, the informal brief concept really survived to this day. I wanted to ask you, did your guidance to the clerks have a little footnote there on how to deal with profanity?
Well, we got a lot of that, and I did, especially since my name was on most of the court orders. I got a lot of hate mail over the time, and a few death threats and comments about my mental competency. Those are the things you just kind of live with.
Yeah.
In 1992, things took a big step forward when after we discovered that we had money left over, we had budgeted, we had operated so well that our money that Congress gave us had a surplus at the end of the fiscal year. And so we went to them and proposed this organization where the Legal Services Corporation would provide a grant to an organization to be created to provide for pro bono representation. And that helped us a lot. And by that time also the court's bar was increasing. A lot of these folks had agency experience dealing with Social Security and workman's comp disability cases, which was the majority of ours. And so they were working their way into the court structure as well. The pro bono consortium, once they were created, they created a series of one-day instructional sessions where various folks who were practitioners before the court, National Veterans Legal Services Program, for example, and DAV, were able to talk about veterans law as it applied below or up to the board level. And then I gave a brief session walking them through the process of the court from appeal to final decision. In exchange for that 1 day of training, the attorneys who attended obligated to take at least one pro bono case. And so that gave us a little jump start as well. As Melanie mentioned,
That jump
Go
start
ahead.
is amazing, Bob. I was just going to say that jump start has been amazing. And, of course, I can hear in the words you're saying current things that we can see today.
Mhm. As Melanie mentioned, this was before the age of automation, or very sophisticated automation. We had an electronic bulletin board in 1994, which eventually morphed into a website. And on the bulletin board, you couldn't read things on the bulletin board. You had to download them, and then you could print them out and read them. So things were a little awkward there. We struggled valiantly and unsuccessfully to develop a full case management system. We had trouble translating to the contract IT people what it was we did, and we had trouble understanding what they said they could do. And so we sort of got part way there and developed a system which was nicknamed Quill. And Quill happened to be Chief Judge Nebaker's middle name. So it was a one that fit okay, but we tried to go to the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts and get them to share their software with us for the federal courts appellate system, and were absolutely unsuccessful. They wouldn't share it all. And finally, as Norm will tell you, after many years, he managed to break the code, and that led to the development of your electronic system today. In 1994, we started a conferencing system. Our central legal staff started a conferencing system to first to resolve the disputes over the record on appeal, and then to narrow the issues that were going to be briefed to the court. This was something that I had picked up at a conference of the National Association of Appellate Court Clerks on procedural civil innovations, and brought it back, talked to the judges, and Judge Farley was eminently familiar with that sort of thing from his experience in the civil division of the Department of Justice. And the central legal staff went through a series of training programs, and we built into our rules this conferencing process. A few months later, one of the judges apparently had not been aware that this was going on for several months, and raised issues about it and about how independent of the judges the process ought to be. And after a blizzard of interchambers emails, it was finally resolved that indeed it should be independent of the judges, and that it should be, the content of the conferences ought to be kept from the judges unless both parties agree. Because when they get down and dirty and start talking seriously about settlement, that's the sort of thing that you want to keep in the case management process and not in the decider process, which is what the judges are. The other thing that we had, experience that we had during our time there, was the government shutdowns. And in 1995, we had two I can't remember whether there was a third one. There was a third one that was threatened, but we had to jump through a few hoops. The first one, we tried to be very conservative and furlough people and limit staffing to absolutely essential, that sort of thing. And by the last time around, we decided that our function was essential, so everybody was going to come to work. The only other thing that was unique during our time, we started the survivor benefits program when one of our judges died in service. And we had to, Becky Alexander had to develop the process with the Department of Agriculture to provide for the payments to the widow, which after a few initial hiccups went pretty well. So those were.
Yeah, Bob, I understand as a humorous point, I understand that you were a major motivator. I came into the office and I found Norm Herring left these behind too, but I found these, what looked like ping pong balls, they're little wiffle balls. And I thought I might get a game of beer pong together or something like that. But I looked at them more closely and realized there were annotations on these things and that they must have a more significant function. So
Yeah.
Pre-computer, this was you at work, is that right?
Right, that's right. And when a single judge decided that he needed a panel or was persuaded to ask for a panel by his colleagues, the judge would ask me to form a panel. And so I had at that time 7 wiffle balls in a Mickey Mouse can, and I would take that judge's ball out of the can, shake the ball, or shake the can, and draw 2 others. And that would be the panel for that case. Eventually, of course, Norm got the protection of a computer system to keep the heat off of him. I remember being challenged about that system, and the judge had one of his law clerks run a screening of the last year or two's panel assignments, and it turned out, surprise, surprise, they were random.
Yeah, oh, that's brilliant. And I'm afraid all the balls didn't make it forward to 2021, Bob, but we get the idea, you know. It's great stuff. Well, and thanks for teeing up some of those ideas for Norm Herring, because you know, certainly the lack of computers was something that we were beyond that, right, Norm? And we're in fact going to turn computers to great use at the court here shortly under your time. Maybe one of you can take us through. Just as a question, follow up, last question, Bob. Was the CLS created during your term? Is that correct? You're muted. You're muted, Bob.
Okay. No, the CLS as an entity was already there, but I think there were 2 or 3 attorneys in it. So it was a pretty slim group, and they when we got into the new facility, we expanded it to 6 and then to 8 attorneys and a paralegal and a couple of secretaries. Right.
Okay. Well, Norm, it sounds like you were handed this high-speed operation by that point. Melanie and Bob had done all the work. You know, it was easy going, right?
Yeah, I certainly did benefit from my predecessors, and I thank them for all they did. It made my job ever so easy, except for the fact that through the first 10 years, the court began to develop a reputation of a place that you could go and get some relief. And the consequence of that was we went from hundreds of cases to 1,000 cases to 2,000 cases to 4,000 cases. And all of a sudden, and at that time when I came on board, there were 7 judges, and we were looking for solutions on how to deal with that. And the conferencing system had already been set up. And we had to figure a way to make that more robust so that we could actually get people to consider it a more mandatory process. And so when we jumped up to 4,000 cases, we did some statistical analysis, and for a Court of Appeals in the United States on a per judge basis, we were at the top of the number of cases for an appellate judge to be considering on an annual basis. That allowed us to make some pitches to Congress to up the sizes of judges to 9 judges. But we continued to be under a considerable amount of scrutiny from Congress because our reporting was fairly significant reporting on the number of cases, how long they took in chambers, how many cases ended up in chambers, and congressional members became more and more interested in the day-to-day operations of the court. And we've always had a wonderful relationship with the funding committees, and that's a unique, sidebar of the way in which court was originated, because Congress passed its enabling legislation onto President Reagan and said the court's budget shall be submitted to the president and on to Congress without comment or change. That was an interesting sidebar I would have every year with whoever was in the OMB office about, well, everybody's going to take a 10% hit this year. And I would say, well, here's this provision in our enactment that says, no, you have to pass our budget on to Congress without comment or change. It worked most of the time. A couple of times we had some comments from OMB that Congress just threw out the window, and they went ahead and addressed us correctly. So we had a number of interesting things that also happened that had an effect on why we had to change. 9/11. I hadn't even been there a year when we were all sadly disturbed by the noise that we could hear from the Pentagon of the plane crashing into the Pentagon. At that time, if you came into the building, there was no security. You just got on the elevator and rode up to the 9th floor, and you were immediately in the court. And that changed radically after 9/11. The U.S. Marshal Service was very cooperative in providing us with additional services to provide screening so that the building was secure. We also had problems with the parking garage, which was very interesting because the FBI building had a daycare center right across the street from us. And so you had children of FBI agents who came and parked in our building. There was a daycare center also in 625. And so as a consequence, we had multiple what were determined to be significant risk in our building. And the parking was unregulated. Anybody who pulled in off the street, get a parking ticket and park under 625. The great trouble that people had understanding what happened in Oklahoma City after the bombing of the federal building wasn't very hard to extrapolate to what could happen in our building if a car, any kind of dangerous nature, happened to park under our building. Plus the judges and all court members who had assigned parking were not differentiated from public parkers. So we had to jump through a lot of hoops to provide additional security for our building. I don't know, last time I was there and came through the parking area, and I think I'm still right, they now inspect the vehicles before they pull into the parking garage. We have separate parking for the judges and senior staff in the court that is not accessible to the general parking public. So if a judge pulls into the building, he can park in a secure area and get out of his car and not be concerned who might be in the parking area. All of those things changed the climate of the court because we had to bump up security. We had an anthrax scare. One of the mail personnel who delivers the mail throughout the court into chambers noted an envelope that had a white powdery substance in it. We had to immediately shut down the building. We had to see the people from a protective service agency come in in moon boots and gloves and walk through the building and put their little clamps on the envelopes and other mail that might have been contaminated and put them in secure pouches and take them away. But our court wasn't the only place that got threatened by those kinds of concerning events. And so we had an experience with radiated documents. Now, I had no idea what they were talking about because all of a sudden our mail started getting slower and slower and slower. And what was happening is that all the mail for agencies like ours was being taken over to someplace in Virginia and run through a great big radiation piece of equipment that supposedly killed anthrax. And then it would be sent on to us. We would get it, and it would be a notice of appeal or a motion for whatever. And it was like it had been crisped, it had been burned up, and it was so very fragile that we had to figure a way that we could take it page by page by page and copy those crispy documents for purposes of preservation. So this was 2 years into my 10 years at the court that we were already changing things drastically on a security basis. And it raised the red flag about what happens if documents actually do get destroyed. And electronic filing was being bandied about throughout the country. And Bob mentioned the National Conference of Appellate Court Clerks. And they're a tremendous organization of appellate court clerks, mostly state courts of appeal, but there were a few federal courts of appeal that participated. And I was particularly fortunate that the clerk from the Fourth Circuit down in Atlanta was a member and pretty much held my hand on a lot of transitional issues about what the federal courts were doing. Because like Bob said, we knew that the Administrative Office of Courts had a fairly robust system, but they weren't sharing. And so we went through an analysis and created a court technology committee through the National Conference of Appellate Court Clerks. And they came from all over, some from the Administrative Office of Courts and some from state Supreme Courts and lower courts of appeal across the country. And we began this dialogue about what are we going to do about electronic records. And the first court that really took a cut at it was the North Carolina Supreme Court. And Christy Cameron, who was the clerk of the North Carolina Supreme Court, was a delightful lady who would share any kind of information. And so twice a year, we had a court technology conference. We went through what they were doing. and Alaska got involved in it because they were multiple time zones and they had attorneys all over the state that had to get time-sensitive documents in to Anchorage, and what were they doing about getting that to happen. And Florida stepped in because they had about 7 different intermediate courts of appeal all over the state, and they got a lot of exposure during the Bush v. Gore case, and all of a sudden the stature of the Florida Supreme Court was elevated. And when they spoke about the way they handled cases, it was considered more important than some other courts. And so we all became involved in this dialogue about electronic filing. And that's pretty much where it started in the 2003, 2004 era. And it took about 5 years for us to go through the process of getting it where it was actually operational and close to what I think you found when you walked in the door, Greg.
Well, that's right. And I was going to say, and that is one of the vestiges of being a court that people take for granted, I think, is that they can go to another federal court and come to our court and have the same kind of interface without going through the PACER system. But, you know, I know I should ask you to tell me just a little bit, or tell all of us a little bit about, you mentioned the AO and how sometimes there's not exactly a red carpet rolled out if you come over asking for help. When I did finally meet the AO counterparts responsible for the case management software, they were really quick to tell me that they didn't appreciate the way we had been shoved up their nose, so to speak, and they had been forced to support us. And of course, I was trying to distance myself from that and establish friendly relations. But how exactly did you, get over there and get them to open the safe and give us the keys to the software?
It was not very easy, I'll be honest with you, because the answer was no, and the long answer was hell no. And so we knew what they had, because you could go into the federal court system and see what their system looks like and how it operates. And like I said, I had a friend who was a clerk of the Fourth Circuit, and we talked about how he was operating and how it was working for him and how he implemented, because it was new to them as well at that time, and how some judges immediately got on board and some judges said, no, I want to see the hard copy documents. Don't give me no electronic records. Or some judges were of the opinion that I don't want electronic records. Still let those people file their paper copies. I like paper copies. And I know a number of guys my age who don't even know what a computer is. And so they had that dichotomy of judges in the federal circuits that was interesting. But I found out how really good it was. And like I said, had excellent relations with our funding committees. All of our budget committees didn't mind calling me and asking me for different numbers and information, and eventually ended up visiting them on a regular basis just to make sure they knew that we're going to be cooperative. And the other thing that was really good, like Bob said, we were a very fiscally responsible federal agency. At the end of every budget year, we had money because we didn't spend it all. And maybe Bob started that concept that was different than every other federal agency of use it or lose it. We turned over a lot of money at the end of every year, and our budget masters appreciated that. And as a consequence, I gently dropped the word in their ear that we're having a real problem in developing a system of electronic records and case management. But right across the street over there in the federal court system, they've got it. They've got it already. And I bet if you pumped up my budget a little bit and I could offer them to pay them for any assistance and systems that they may install, it won't be such a bitter pill for them to share with us. Well, they did exactly that thing, and that kind of threw the AOC for a loop, but the answer was still no. We don't need your money. We don't want your money. We have enough problems just handling the courts that we've already got, much less taking on courts that are not part of the administrative office. So I went back to the folks over on the Hill and said, I need a little more push here for them to open up the doors at the administrative office of the court. Well, it wasn't too much longer after that I got a call and asked to come over and sit down in a training session that they were doing for the federal courts for e-filing. And I took my technology manager with me. We saw the system, kind of made a understanding of what it would take to adapt it for our court. It was nip and tuck for a long time because they just didn't want to cooperate. And every time I went to see them, I don't know if it was every federal court clerk that had to wait outside and sit on a bench for 20 minutes before you went to see some technology official in the court. But they certainly made us know that we were an inferior agency. But after it was all said and done, it took a couple of years for them to provide all the coding and data that was necessary for us to set it up. It, as you know, and I think it continues to be an incredibly robust system that works very well, that allows us to move the, I don't know, thousands and thousands and thousands of case records online, and allows judges wherever they may be to look at the record on appeal, and for the central legal staff not to have that huge cart that they had to put on the elevator and roll up to the central legal staff with all the case files that they were going to review on that day that had to be pulled by the clerk's office on the 9th floor to put on that huge cart to roll it upstairs. And it transformed how we did business.
Yeah. And it really turned out, Norm, it was really the key to, or one of the keys to the ability of all this great technology to allow us to work remotely. So, you know, getting us into that was really a key thing. And I will tell you that the way you described the process, I think you were maybe a little tougher on them than you even are telling, because by the time I wandered in, they hadn't forgotten that.
Well, I like them. They're smart and they're capable, and they stepped up to the plate when we needed their help. And after convincing them, because somebody beat them over the head, it wasn't a good idea to tell them, you want me to send that guy down to beat you up again.
Yeah.
No, it worked.
In the early days, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Melanie.
I was just going to say, in the early days, they loved us. We even had a gentleman detailed from them to spend several months with us. Of course, we weren't talking about electronics and trying to get their data and so forth, but it was Jim Caldwell from the AO who came over, and just, he was an enormous.
He was still there when I was there.
Oh, really? Oh.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't know that, Melanie, but I did talk to Jim Caldwell because he took a job with the AO, was promoted several times, became their head of security.
Oh.
And, he told me that he had written a policy that at our court, and I couldn't quite figure out why he'd written a policy to court, but he had kind of had a pit stop at the court before continuing employment at the AO. So I didn't know that. Was he put over by the AO in our space to help us figure things out, or?
We had to ask for him, for someone, and Jim turned out to be the person that we got, and he was enormously helpful. And he was very good at working with the judges in a very diplomatic way.
Yeah. Well, and that's a missing link I really didn't understand, which I think there's a lot of missing links here that get made up when we all start talking together. But Brad, I don't know if you wanted to open this for questions. I wanted to tell the group, I suspect a few of you signed on because you thought maybe the judge, these brilliant clerks of court would maybe tell some wild stories about judges. And, I hate to disappoint you all because, that's like a secret society, I mean, you gotta, you gotta have, as Judge Souter or Clerk Souter used to say from the Supreme Court, you gotta have the secret handshake to get inside that discussion because, all of our judges are individual personalities. And I did tell Chief Judge Bartley that we'd steer away from those judge stories unless they were funny, and I did want, just to give you a taste of what's kind of out there, I did want to tell folks a little story. It involves then Chief Judge Hagel. And my colleagues will probably remember funny stories like this when they hear this, but every year before you could digitize photos, you'd get the judges in and have a group photo taken. And as you can imagine, there's a little bit of haggling over which version of the photo is best because we got to make sure we look the way we do and blah, 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 typical thing. And I had gone in to see Judge Hagel and I handed him a pile of, I don't know, must have been 50 pictures. And okay, here you go, Judge Hagel, let me know when you've been able to figure out which photo you use. I kind of thought, well, I'll be back in a few months. And I hadn't even left his office. And he called out to me and he said, hey, you forgot the photos. And I said, my God, how did you get through that pile and decide which photo you're going to use? And he said, well, it's really quite easy. I just went through until I found the one where I look best. True. Minds at work, decisive decision-making at work. And at any rate, in between all of the stories that I think the clerks are telling, there's a lot of hard work, but there's a lot of things that are fun too. And at the end of the day, I think if we get together, what we'd be talking about, something that's remarkable to me, and that is the continuity at the court in the number of people, in other words, who stay for long periods. And I think it's because they love the mission and they love the people and they respect the judges and what the judges do. And, in fact, Karen Meyer, some of you would remember, is going to be the first person in the court's history to spend her entire career at the court. She came 30 years ago and will retire in just another month and a half or so. And she's representative of some of the folks who you see around here, even the people in the building. I saw Roberto today, and a few of you would remember Roberto. He's still around. He's still looking after us. And he's not even in the court, but he still, I think, loves the court and feels very part of the court family. And we feel that way about him for sure. Brad, do we have time? Anybody like to ask any questions?
Yeah, if people could put questions in the chat box. We've got one that's already there. And the question was, did any crispy documents ever actually get too crumbly to read? And if so, how were you able to recover the pleading?
Well, I guess that's to me. And I don't recall us losing any. There were some that were really, really faded due to the radiation. But we were able to put them in a copier and set it on darker setting and recreate the document that way. But we had to do a lot of those on a page by page by page basis to recreate and preserve those documents.
We had a problem with torn flaps and part of the letter would be hanging out. But we also used the copy machine and tried to fix it the best we could so that we could at least read what had been on the envelope or the back part of the envelope. We're pretty successful, we think.
There's another question here about how did the role of CLS evolve?
Well, I'll take the first hit at that because CLS existed when I came on board, and there were conferences with counsel at that time. And like Bob said, we continued the practice that conference conversations were confidential. And when the number of cases started increasing, we noted that mediation might be a really good skill for CLS attorneys to possess. And Kerry Sklar, who was counsel to the clerk at that time, and I believe he's now general counsel to the court, worked with me, and we found professional mediation training programs for all the CLS staff to go to. And they, again, developed talents that aren't generally taught in law school about how to get people to the middle in case resolution. And you look at the number of cases that are resolved on an annual basis, and those that are resolved by the clerk as a consequence of conferences and mediation. I don't know how many CLS employees Bob had, but when I left, there were 14 attorneys in CLS handling conference and mediation. So it became very instrumental for us moving cases along and getting both sides to resolution. And my opinion is that, and I know attorneys in the general bar will disagree, but CLS attorneys, that's all they do is veterans law. And they are, in my opinion, the most knowledgeable, competent veterans lawyers in the country. I know if you're practicing in front of the court, you may not agree with that, but that's certainly my opinion.
Yeah, we started with 2 in the central legal staff when I came aboard, and then grew to 8. And the chief judge had a pretty strong hand in establishing the relationship between CLS and chambers. He set it up so that the clerk was the supervisor of CLS, that CLS attorneys were not additional law clerks for the chambers. And so if a judge wanted to tweak a draft opinion that had been provided to him, that the judges' chambers would do that tweaking, and not, it wouldn't be a bounce back and forth between CLS and the judge. And that helped establish those ground rules.
Yeah, that's great background. I know that the CLS probably in the beginnings too, Bob, was involved in screening cases as they went forward to chambers and help maybe gain some uniformity. That largely has evolved out to make room for the overwhelming demands on conferencing.
Mhm.
But I will tell you, in the first years that the court substantial recall of senior judges began, and as you heard, now we have 4 judges serving through the year in senior judges. We had no law clerks, and CLS contributed to helping the seniors who were recalled get through some cases and move cases. So as I understood in talking to other federal court clerks, I really have talked over the years to every circuit. The CLS is the flex in an organization, and they're the ones who really end up taking right and left turns and doing something a little different over the term of a court to accommodate its needs. And that's certainly our central legal staff story, and their contributions today are overwhelming. I mean, they really are. When you think 9,000 cases, that just wouldn't work if the CLS conferencing process was not in place.
I think that's all we've got in terms of questions. I just wanted to thank all of the panelists. Thank you, Melanie and Bob and Norm, and especially Mr. Block. Thank you for participating in this event. I want to thank the Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims Bar Association and their president, Jason Johns, for helping co-sponsor this and helping us advertise it. I really appreciate everyone's involvement. This has been fascinating. it's really great that we're able to put something like this together. But I'll give Mr. Block, as our moderator and overall presenter here, the final word.
Well, and thanks, Brad. And my final word would be to each of my predecessors on behalf of the court, and certainly on behalf of our chief judges up and through Chief Judge Bartley, thanks for what you've done to help us create foundations for what we do today. It's amazing. I was saying to Chief Judge Bartley the other day, it's fascinating to wonder what is it that I was working on when I was working so hard that would not just do something good today, but would have an enduring quality for this organization that's so significant, I think, on the national level to taking care of the nation's veterans. And I think, and I hope you've heard through our discussions today, and what I talked about is happening in 2021, that you all touch things that really were enduring and exist to this day because they were great when you created them. So I don't know if my own period will have some of those things in it. I hope they do. I think we all thought that maybe a standalone courthouse would be something we'd accomplish during our periods. None of us have been able to pull that off. And I think we've had chief judges give that the real college try over the years too. I know as I worked with Judge Davis, he certainly gave it the college try. But the fact is we're in incredible facilities here, and we make them better all the time. And when we're not here, we're a fully functioning court working remotely. So again, final word, thanks to each of you for your contributions. I will look forward to hosting you if you're in and around DC post-pandemic. We'll look forward to seeing you in the future. And also, Brad, thanks to you. And Jason, thanks as well for giving us the opportunity to bend people's ears about old clerk stuff.
It's great to see you all.
Thanks again to everyone. We really appreciate everyone coming, and we hope to continue to put on interesting events about the Court of Veterans Appeals history and everyone that was involved in making that. So with that, have a great afternoon, and thank you all.